For 20 years, my mornings always began the same way. Not with an alarm clock, not with the sound of traffic outside, but with the soft movement of my wife in the kitchen. Her name was Eleanor, and every morning, before the sun had fully risen, she would quietly walk into the kitchen and begin preparing breakfast. The sound was always gentle, the quiet click of the stove, the soft clink of two coffee cups touching the counter, the slow rhythm of a knife cutting toast. Sometimes I woke up before her, sometimes after, but the result was always the same. When I walked into the kitchen, Eleanor was already there, standing near the window, her hair tied loosely behind her head, morning light resting softly on her shoulders. "Good morning," she would say, not loudly, not dramatically, just in that calm voice that made every morning feel safe. I used to believe those mornings would last forever, not because I thought about the future, but because routine has a strange way of convincing us that life will always stay the same. Our kitchen was not large, just a small square room with a wooden table and two chairs. The table sat beside a window that faced the street. Every morning we watched the same quiet neighborhood slowly wake up. The mail truck passed around 7. Mrs. Thompson walked her small white dog at exactly 7:10, and the school bus arrived at the corner at 7:25. Life moved in simple, predictable patterns, and Eleanor loved those patterns. She believed small routines were the secret to a peaceful life. "Big moments are rare," she once told me while pouring coffee. "But small moments happen every day. That's where happiness lives." At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. Now I do. For 20 years, we sat across from each other at that same table. 2 plates, 2 cups of coffee, 2 quiet conversations. Sometimes we talked about important things: work, family, plans for the weekend. But most mornings, the conversation was simpler. "Did you sleep well? Do we need more milk? Looks like it might rain today." Ordinary words, ordinary mornings. And yet those ordinary mornings quietly became the most valuable part of my life. Eleanor had a habit I used to tease her about. Every morning she would open the kitchen window slightly, even in winter, just a few inches. "Fresh air wakes up the house," she would say. Cold air would drift inside. Sometimes I would shiver and pull my sweater tighter, but she would just smile. "The house needs to breathe," she insisted. Back then, it felt like one of her many small charming habits. Now that window feels like a memory I can almost touch. The last breakfast we shared together was completely ordinary. There were no warning signs, no dramatic final conversation, just another quiet morning. Eleanor made eggs and toast. I poured the coffee. We sat across from each other like we had thousands of times before. She told me about a book she had started reading, something about a woman who traveled alone across the country. Eleanor liked stories about journeys. "I think people are braver than they believe," she said while spreading butter on her toast. I remember nodding, but I wasn't really listening closely. My mind was already thinking about a meeting I had later that day. It's strange how memory works. The moments we think are ordinary sometimes become the ones we wish we had held on to more carefully. Later that afternoon, everything changed. But this story is not about that moment. Some memories are too heavy to retell slowly. What matters for the story is the morning that came afterward, the first morning without Eleanor. I woke up before sunrise that day. At first, I didn't understand why. The house felt different somehow, too quiet, too still. For a few seconds, I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind trying to remember what was wrong. Then the memory returned, not suddenly, not violently, just quietly, like a shadow entering the room. Eleanor was gone. The words are simple, but the reality behind them is something language never fully captures. I stayed in bed for a long time. The room felt unfamiliar, even though nothing had moved. Her side of the bed remained perfectly still, the pillow untouched. Eventually, I sat up slowly. Morning light had begun slipping through the curtains, the same light that had filled our mornings for years. For a moment, I almost expected to hear her footsteps in the kitchen, the soft clink of coffee cups, the quiet sound of toast popping from the toaster. But the house remained silent. I walked slowly down the hallway, each step echoing slightly on the wooden floor. Something about that sound felt strange, as if the house itself had become larger overnight. When I reached the kitchen doorway, I stopped. The room looked exactly the same. The wooden table, the two chairs, the small window facing the street. But something invisible had disappeared. Presence. For years, the kitchen had always felt alive in the morning. Now it felt like a photograph. I stepped inside. The air felt colder than usual. On the counter sat the coffee machine, the same machine Eleanor had used every morning. Without thinking, I reached for 2 cups, just as I had done for years. My hand stopped halfway across the counter. 2 cups were no longer necessary. So I slowly returned 1 cup to the cabinet and kept only one. That small moment felt heavier than anything else that morning. I poured the coffee and carried the cup to the table. Then I sat down in the same chair where I had always sat. Across from me was Eleanor's chair, empty. And sunlight slowly moved across the table. The street outside looked exactly the same. Mrs. Thompson walked her dog at 7:10. The school bus arrived at 7:25. The world had not changed, but inside the kitchen, something felt different. The silence was no longer just quiet. It felt like it was speaking. And that was the moment I realized something I had never understood before. Silence can have a voice. And that morning, for the first time in 20 years, I was finally hearing it. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time that morning. The coffee in my cup slowly cooled. Steam rose at first, then faded quietly into the air, but I didn't drink it. I just watched it. Across from me, Eleanor's chair remained exactly where it had always been, slightly pushed in. Her napkin still folded neatly beside the plate. Small details that had never seemed important before suddenly felt enormous. For years, our mornings had begun in that exact spot. 2 people, 2 cups of coffee, 2 voices filling the small kitchen. Now there was only one. The silence did not rush in all at once. It arrived slowly, like fog drifting across a quiet field. At first, it simply felt calm, then it felt heavy. I realized something strange as I sat there. Without conversation, time moves differently. Minutes stretch longer. Small sounds become louder. The ticking clock on the wall suddenly seemed much more noticeable. Tick, tick, tick. For 20 years, that clock had always been there. But Eleanor's voice had always been louder. Now the clock had the room to speak. Eventually, I stood up and walked toward the kitchen window. It was still closed. Eleanor had not opened it that morning. For a moment, I simply stared at it, my hand resting lightly on the frame. Then I remembered her words. Fresh air wakes up the house. Slowly, I lifted the window. Just a few inches, the same way she always did. Cool morning air slipped gently into the kitchen. It carried the faint scent of wet grass and distant traffic. The neighborhood was beginning its usual routine. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. A dog barked briefly. Birds moved through the trees. Life continued exactly as it always had. But inside the house, everything felt unfamiliar. I walked back to the table and sat down again. This time, I took a small sip of the coffee. It tasted the same, but it felt different. Eleanor had always added a tiny pinch of cinnamon to the coffee grounds before brewing it, a habit she had picked up years ago. She said it made mornings feel warmer. For years, I had barely noticed. Now the taste made my chest tighten slightly. It's strange how grief hides inside small things, not always in big dramatic memories, sometimes in something as simple as cinnamon in coffee. I glanced again at Eleanor's chair, and suddenly a memory appeared so clearly it almost felt real. A morning from many years ago. Winter, snow falling softly outside the kitchen window. Eleanor was wearing a thick blue sweater, her hands wrapped around a warm coffee cup, her hair slightly messy because she had just woken up. "Do you think we'll still sit here when we're old?" she asked suddenly. I laughed at the question. "Aren't we already getting there?" I joked. She smiled, but her eyes stayed thoughtful. "I mean really old," she said. "Like the couples you see walking slowly in the park." I remember shrugging. "Sure," I said. "Why not?" At the time, the future had felt far away, almost imaginary. Now that memory felt painfully close. I looked around the kitchen again. Nothing had moved, nothing had changed, but the room felt larger somehow, as if the absence of one person had quietly doubled the space. For years, Eleanor had filled every corner of the house with small energy, not loud energy, just presence, the way she hummed softly while cooking, the way she adjusted the curtains to let in more sunlight, the way she always left books open on the table because she planned to continue reading later. Those little movements had once seemed ordinary. Now they felt like the heartbeat of the house. I stood up and began walking slowly through the rooms: the living room, the hallway, the bedroom. Each space carried small reminders of Eleanor: a scarf draped over the back of a chair, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, a book resting on the bedside table with a bookmark halfway through. For a moment, I considered moving these things, cleaning up, putting everything away. But something inside me resisted the idea. Not yet, because moving those objects felt like erasing something, and I wasn't ready for that. So I returned to the kitchen, the one room that had always belonged equally to both of us. I sat down again and looked at the table: 2 placemats, 2 chairs. Slowly, almost without thinking, I reached across the table and touched the surface of Eleanor's placemat. The fabric was smooth, familiar, ordinary, but the gesture made the silence feel even deeper. That was the moment I understood something important. When someone leaves your life, the world doesn't suddenly become empty. Instead, it becomes full of echoes. Every chair, every room, every small routine holds a memory, and those memories speak quietly through silence. Outside the window, the school bus arrived at the corner. Children climbed aboard one by one, backpacks swinging, voices laughing. For a moment, I simply watched them, life moving forward without hesitation. Then I noticed something I had never really paid attention to before. One small boy stopped near the bus door and turned around. He waved back toward his house. A woman stood on the porch waving back. The moment lasted only a few seconds. Then the bus door closed and drove away. But something about that simple scene stayed with me. Life continues in small waves. People leaving, people returning, moments beginning, moments ending. I looked down at my coffee cup again. Only half of it remained. For 20 years, breakfast had always ended the same way. Eleanor would stand up first, carry both cups to the sink, then turn back toward me with a small smile. "Ready for another day?" she would ask. That morning, for the first time, there was no one to ask the question. So the silence asked it instead. Ready for another day? I sat there quietly for a long moment, listening to the house, listening to the silence that now lived inside it. Then slowly, very slowly, I stood up from the table. When I stood up from the kitchen table, the room felt even quieter than before. Not empty, just still. The chair legs made a soft sound against the floor as I pushed my seat back. For 20 years, that small sound had been followed by another one. Eleanor's chair moving too. Two small movements ending the same quiet breakfast. Now there was only one. I carried my coffee cup to the sink and rinsed it slowly. Water ran over the porcelain. The sound echoed lightly in the kitchen. For a moment, I almost reached for a second cup. The habit was still there, so deeply built into my hands that my body moved before my mind could stop it. But the second cup remained in the cabinet, exactly where I had placed it earlier. I dried the cup carefully and set it on the rack beside the sink. The action felt final, like closing a small chapter of the morning. When I turned around, the kitchen looked different again. Not because anything had moved, but because something had changed inside me. The silence was still there, but now it felt less like an intruder and more like a quiet companion. For years, Eleanor had filled mornings with gentle energy, the sound of her voice, the rhythm of her footsteps, the warmth of conversation. Now the silence had taken her place, not to replace her, but to hold the space where she had been. And strangely, it did so with a kind of respect. I walked slowly into the living room. Morning light had begun to spread across the carpet. Thin lines of sunlight moved across the furniture. And Eleanor loved mornings like this. She often said that early sunlight made the house feel hopeful. On the coffee table sat a small stack of books she had been reading. One of them lay open with a bookmark near the middle, the story she had told me about during our last breakfast, the one about a woman traveling across the country alone. I picked up the book and looked at the cover. The title was simple, just a quiet story about someone searching for something new. Eleanor had always loved stories about journeys, even small ones. Once, years ago, we had taken a spontaneous drive along the coast. No plan, no reservations. Just the two of us following the road beside the ocean. We stopped at a tiny restaurant near the water, the kind of place with wooden chairs and faded photographs on the walls. And I remember Eleanor looking out the window at the waves. "This is what freedom feels like," she said. At the time, I thought she meant the vacation, a break from work, a weekend away from routine. Now I wondered if she had meant something deeper. I placed the book gently back on the table. The living room felt calm, almost peaceful, but there was one room I had not entered yet, the bedroom. For a moment, I stood in the hallway looking at the door. It was half open. Morning light stretched softly across the floor inside. I stepped forward slowly. The bed remained exactly as it had been the night before, my side slightly disturbed, her side perfectly smooth. Two pillows rested side by side, one slightly flattened from years of use, the other untouched. I walked to the window and pulled the curtains open. Sunlight filled the room instantly. Eleanor always liked the curtains open in the morning. She said sunlight made sadness feel smaller. Standing there, I realized something important. The house was still full of her ways of living. The open window, the morning coffee, the sunlight in the bedroom. Even in her absence, those habits remained. And maybe that was not a sad thing. Maybe it was a kind of quiet gift. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress shifted slightly beneath my weight. The room felt calm, still, safe. Grief, I was beginning to understand, does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it arrives like weather after the storm has passed, quiet, heavy, lingering in the air. But inside that quiet, memories begin to speak, not loudly, just softly enough for you to hear them. I remembered something Eleanor had said to me once, years ago. We had been walking through a park in autumn, leaves covering the path beneath our feet. She stopped suddenly and looked around at the trees. People think love is the big moments, she said. Weddings, anniversaries, grand gestures. Then she smiled gently. But love actually lives in ordinary days. At the time, I nodded without thinking much about it. Now those words felt like a message left behind for me to find later. After a while, I stood up from the bed. The house was beginning to warm as the morning sun climbed higher. I walked back into the kitchen. The open window let in fresh air. The clock on the wall continued its quiet rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Earlier that sound had felt lonely. Now it felt steady, reliable. Time was still moving. Life was still moving, even when someone we love is no longer beside us. I poured a second cup of coffee, not because I needed it, but because the kitchen felt like it was waiting for something. This time, instead of sitting in my usual chair, I sat in Eleanor's chair. The view of the room changed instantly. From that seat, I could see the sink, the stove, the window, and the hallway. It was the view she had seen every morning for 20 years. And in that moment, something surprising happened. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of quiet memories. Memories of laughter, of conversations about nothing important, of small moments that had slowly built an entire life. I took a slow sip of the coffee. Then I looked around the kitchen again, and for the first time since that difficult morning began, I realized something gentle but important. Even though Eleanor was gone, the life we built together was still here, inside the walls, inside the routines, inside the quiet spaces of the house. And maybe, just maybe, that meant the silence wasn't here to take something away. Maybe it was here to help me remember. Sitting in Eleanor's chair felt unfamiliar at first. For 20 years, I had always sat across from her, watching her stir coffee, watching her open the kitchen window, watching her quietly begin the morning. Now I was seeing the kitchen from her side of the table. The view was different, but strangely comforting. From that chair, I could see the hallway that led to the bedroom, the small clock on the wall, the sunlight falling across the wooden floor. I realized something quietly surprising. This had been Eleanor's view every morning for 2 decades. This was the space where she had watched our life begin each day. I rested my hands around the warm coffee cup. The kitchen was still silent, but it no longer felt like a cold silence. It felt softer, like a room that was remembering. For a long time, I simply sat there, not thinking too hard, just letting the morning move slowly around me. Outside the window, a breeze moved through the trees. Leaves brushed softly against one another. A distant car passed down the street. Ordinary sounds, the same sounds Eleanor and I had heard together thousands of times. But now I was hearing them more clearly, as if silence had turned up the volume on the world. And after a while, I stood up and began washing the breakfast plate. It was a simple task, water running, hands moving slowly, the small rhythm of cleaning. Eleanor used to say washing dishes early in the morning made the house feel organized. A clean kitchen is a calm mind, she often joked. For years I had teased her about that saying, but now I found myself carefully drying the plate and placing it neatly on the rack, exactly the way she always had. Some habits remain long after the person who started them is gone. When the kitchen was finished, I walked toward the living room again. Sunlight had filled the space now. The room felt warmer, brighter. On the shelf near the sofa sat a small wooden box. I hadn't noticed it earlier. It was one of Eleanor's memory boxes. She liked keeping small objects that reminded her of meaningful moments: movie tickets, postcards, old photographs. I picked up the box and opened it slowly. Inside were dozens of tiny pieces of the past: a folded train ticket from a trip we had taken years ago, a dried flower from our garden, a small photograph of the two of us standing beside a lake. I remembered that day clearly. It had been a quiet weekend getaway. Nothing special planned, just a drive into the countryside. In the photo, Eleanor was smiling toward the camera, wind gently moving her hair, the lake stretching behind us. I stared at the photograph for a long moment, not with sadness, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Because the photo reminded me of something simple. We had lived a full life together, not perfect, but full. As I closed the box, another memory appeared, one I had not thought about in years. It was a rainy morning, maybe 10 years ago. We were sitting at the kitchen table just like always, coffee steaming in our cups. Eleanor was watching the rain move slowly down the window. Then she asked a question that had seemed random at the time. "If something ever happened to me first," she said softly, "do you think you'd still open the window every morning?" I remember laughing at the question. "Why would I stop?" I said. She smiled gently. "Because routines are how we keep love alive," she replied. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant, but standing there in the quiet living room now, I finally did. Routines are not just habits. They are small bridges between people. The morning coffee, the open window. At the shared table, even after one person is gone, those bridges remain. I carried the memory box back to the shelf and placed it carefully where it had been. The house felt calmer now, not empty, just quieter. Grief, I was realizing, changes shape as the hours pass. At first, it feels like a sudden absence. Then slowly, it becomes a quiet presence, not painful every second, just there, like a shadow that moves beside you. I returned to the kitchen again. The clock now showed almost 9 in the morning. Time had continued moving while I walked through memories. The open window let in warmer air now. The neighborhood sounded busier, people beginning their normal day. And for the first time that morning, I felt something new, not happiness, not yet, but something close to acceptance. Eleanor had once told me something during one of our evening walks, a thought I had almost forgotten until now. "Love doesn't disappear when someone leaves," she said. "It just changes where it lives." Back then, I thought she meant love lives inside memories. Now I understood something deeper. Love lives inside the way we continue living, inside the routines we keep, inside the kindness we carry forward, inside the quiet moments when we remember someone and smile instead of cry. I poured the last bit of coffee from the pot into my cup. Then I sat down again at the kitchen table, this time back in my own chair. Across from me, Eleanor's chair remained empty, but it didn't feel as lonely as it had earlier that morning. The silence was still there, but now it felt different, almost like it was giving me space to think, space to breathe, space to slowly begin a new version of life. Because even though that morning had begun with loss, it was slowly becoming something else, a beginning, a quiet, uncertain beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. The second cup of coffee tasted different, not better, not worse, just different. For years, Eleanor and I had shared the same morning rhythm: 2 cups, 2 chairs, 2 quiet people beginning the day together. Now there was only 1 cup on the table, but somehow the routine still felt familiar. I leaned back slightly in my chair and looked around the kitchen again. The same walls, the same window, the same wooden cabinets Eleanor had insisted we keep instead of remodeling. New kitchens feel like hotels, she used to say. I want a kitchen that feels lived in. At the time, I didn't think much about that sentence, but now I understood exactly what she meant. A lived-in kitchen carries memories, small ones, ordinary ones, the kind that quietly build a life. My eyes rested on the chair across from me, Eleanor's chair. For a moment, I imagined her sitting there again, elbows resting lightly on the table, coffee warming her hands, watching the sunlight slowly fill the room. Not a sad image, just a peaceful one. After a while, I stood up and walked to the sink again. The cup in my hand felt warm but lighter now. I rinsed it slowly, letting the water run over the ceramic surface. Eleanor always washed dishes immediately. 5 minutes now saves 10 minutes later, she would say. I smiled softly, remembering that. And funny how the smallest sayings stay with us the longest. When the cup was clean, I placed it on the drying rack. Then I dried my hands on the same towel Eleanor had hung there 2 days earlier. For a brief second, grief tried to return. That sudden awareness that she would never hang another towel there again. But instead of pushing the feeling away, I let it pass through quietly, like a wave that rises and slowly settles. Loss does that. It arrives in small moments, unexpectedly. But each time it passes, it leaves something behind. Sometimes sadness, sometimes gratitude. I walked toward the front door and stepped outside onto the porch. Morning sunlight had fully arrived now. The street looked ordinary. Neighbors walking dogs, a car backing slowly out of a driveway, a jogger passing by with headphones on. Life continuing, exactly as it always does. For years, Eleanor and I had sat on this porch on Sunday mornings, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood wake up. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't, but the quiet never felt empty. It felt shared. I sat down in the porch chair and looked at the sky, clear blue, a few thin clouds moving slowly. Eleanor loved mornings like this. She used to say they felt like the world was taking a deep breath. As I sat there, I realized something gently important. This morning had been the first one without her, but it would not be the last morning of my life. There would be other mornings, other cups of coffee, other quiet moments of reflection, and slowly I would learn how to live inside those mornings again. Grief does not ask us to forget. It asks us to carry memory in a different way, not as a weight, but as a companion. Eleanor was no longer sitting across from me at the breakfast table, but the life we built together was still here, in the house, in the routines, in the quiet wisdom she left behind. I stood up from the porch chair and took one more look down the street. The world was moving forward, and for the first time since the morning began, I felt ready to move forward with it. Not quickly, not perfectly, but step by step, one morning at a time, because love doesn't end when someone is gone. Sometimes it simply changes shape and becomes the quiet strength that helps us keep living.